Hello, kiddies. This is the Crypt Keeper, and you're listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Be careful what you ask for. You may get it.
Hey, campfire crew. Let's get it on. Why I'll Never Go to a Haunted Attraction Again by Deadly Blue. This happened late October, Halloween night of 2016. I was 8 years old when this happened. I was always a loud, hyper, and anxious kid growing up, and one night at dinner my mom told me about a haunted maze and asked if I wanted to go for Halloween and invite 2 of my friends. Obviously, I said yes, because, who wouldn't want to go with 2 of their best friends? Anyway, me and my parents picked up my 2 best friends at the time, Darian and Jace. Darian was hyper and loud, just like me, while Jace was quiet, but not super quiet. Anyway, we pulled up to the attraction, and from what I remember, it was a building where I guess you had to pay, and a huge maze and patches of woods were behind it. For some odd reason, we wanted to split up, but not immediately. We started walking around the maze, and of course there was the little jump scare animatronics and things like that. Then there was this man who had a scream mask but regular clothes. He came out from a corner and jump scared both me and Darian. Keep in mind, Jace and my mom went to one side, while me and Darian went to another. When he jump scared us, we nearly shit ourselves. A few seconds later, the man started saying stuff like, "Hey kids, I'm sorry I scared you. I have candy in the back. Do y'all want some?" We were taught stranger danger, and I said no. But that didn't faze him. He kept begging and even started getting aggressive. We told him to go away, and he did. Darian started to cry a little, but I calmed him down pretty quickly. An hour passed, and we were getting to the woods part that's when I noticed the same guy from before was now walking behind us and following us. We started walking faster until he started sprinting towards us. We were faster than him. He seemed like 50 or so. That's when Darian ran another way because he was freaked out. Now I was alone, calling out for Darian. I was genuinely freaked out too. Then a hand grabbed me and I heard another person say, "Grab him, grab him!" I somehow managed to get the arm off of me and I full sprinted away. I heard a gunshot bounce off one of the walls as I ran. I sprinted all the way back to the main entrance where I saw my whole group making a missing report for me. I explained everything while the police were called, and I later found out that there was no man working there with a scream mask, and the police also found many rifles and weapons in the woods. This one freaks me out talking about it, even now. Looking for Closure by Disastrous Exam. Earlier this year in November, me and my family went to Gatlinburg, Tennessee. The whole trip was great and we had a wonderful time up until the last night. We had stayed at 2 cabins. The first one was in a more rural location surrounded by other cabins. The second one was located further east in the mountains, and it seemed more like a house that was renovated into a cabin style. It had a narrow dirt road and a heavy incline. Anyway, the night had been going great. We had dinner together, played games, and settled down for our last night. Me and my girlfriend were sharing a room, and it was located on the right side of the house closer to the woods. My brother and his girlfriend were in the room next to us, closer to the kitchen. My girlfriend and I had a little trouble sleeping at first, but eventually passed out around 11. Before I continue, let me explain this room's layout. It was small. It had 2 windows, one on the back wall and one on the right side of the room. The bed was directly in the middle of the head of the bed against the back window. My girlfriend woke up at around 1:30 to the noise of a faint humming sound. She had woken me up shortly thereafter, and that's when I noticed it too. It was faint at first, but as we began to speak, the hums got a little louder. They were deep, and we would hear them about every 4 seconds. It couldn't have been a TV, as all of them had been turned off before bed, and at that point everyone in the house was asleep. At first, me and her were joking around about it and thinking it was an owl or some other cute animal. My girlfriend began to get up from the bed and turned to the window that was directly behind us. Before she opened the blinds, though, I was hit with this sudden feeling of dread. It felt like no matter what, I couldn't let her look out that window. So I quickly grabbed her arm and told her, "Don't look out the window." At that point, the hairs on my arms were raised and my eyes were beginning to tear up. I mean, that never really happened to me, and she immediately asked why. And I told her, I don't know, something just doesn't feel right. She took me seriously, and we both sat there listening to the hums get louder and closer. We quieted down so as to not make a sound in hopes that whatever it was would go away, and surely enough, it did. After around 15 minutes of sitting there in silence, the hums had gotten quieter and quieter until they stopped altogether. No longer being able to sleep, we began to try looking up what it could have been, and we looked up all the nearby animals and the noises they made to hopefully find a match, but we were unsuccessful. At that point, it had been over an hour since the last time we'd heard the hum, and we began to get tired again. My girlfriend turned onto her side and said that she was going to try to sleep, and I told her that I was going to head to bed shortly. While I was tired from the long day, I couldn't help but think about what that noise was. So to get my mind off of it, I watched some videos on my phone. And as I turned over to lay down, my phone slipped off the bed and landed on the wood floor. At that very moment, I felt my chest tighten up. My girlfriend, being alerted to the sound, turned over and looked at me. I didn't move a muscle. We both sat in silence as we heard that faint hum again. This time we heard it get louder, much louder. It felt like it was right outside the window. Most of the time after that, it was just spent in silence as we heard the hums echo nearby. It felt like the loud noise had attracted it back to the vicinity of the house. After a little bit, it backed off a bit and had gotten quieter, but you could tell that it was still nearby. At that point, it was around 2:50 or 3 a.m., and not knowing what to do, we sealed our fear and tried our best to ignore it and close our eyes. We both fell asleep after that and didn't wake up again until 8 a.m. I tried to explain it to the rest of my family and even my brother, who is normally all about this kind of thing. But everyone blew me off and said I was just hearing things or was an animal of some sort. When I tell you I have never experienced anything like this before, I mean it. The fear that I had was almost unreal, and I know this whole thing feels made up, but I swear it isn't. Me and my girlfriend know what we heard and what we felt, and we don't even bother telling anyone about it anymore, because they never believe us. I felt as though I had to get this experience off my chest, and hopefully someone can help maybe explain what that sound was, or if they've ever experienced anything like it before. Thank you for allowing me to share our experience. Fake Barbecue Gets Worse by Feral Doves. This took place a while ago, 2015-ish, but I'll never forget it. I was 21 at the time, and I'm a female. I was still fairly new in my city, and I had just gotten out of a bad relationship. I wasn't in the best place mentally, and I didn't know a lot of people in town besides my ex and his friends. I was on a dating hookup app looking for people to hang out with casually, maybe find a friend with benefits or something. I matched with a 25-year-old guy named Simon. We talked sporadically on the app for a few days, and he explained he was in a band and living in a house with his bandmates. He sent me their music. It was just audio on YouTube with a heavily edited still image of 4 or 5 guys playing rock instruments. One of them looked like him. The music was an interesting combination of styles and not really for me, but whatever. He seemed like a nice enough guy. He stopped replying for a few days, and I figured that was that, and I moved on. Then, one day I was at work and got a message from him saying sorry, he'd been so busy, and he invited me to a barbecue with his friends and bandmates in their yard. He explained to me that their band manager was providing them the house to live in. Based on the lack of views on the YouTube video and the fact that I only saw one photo of him playing in the band, I figured he was probably exaggerating the band manager thing. I thought it was more likely something along the lines of a bar manager friend giving them a discount on rent in exchange for being a house band at their bar, or something like that. I didn't think much of it beyond that. Normally, I would have just said no to going to a barbecue alone at the home of someone I really didn't know. But I was really bored, and I figured I might be able to overcome some social anxiety, and maybe even make some female friends there, since he made it sound like it was going to be a pretty big party. I put the neighborhood he gave me into maps, and it was a suburban area with lots of families as far as I knew. I figured being in a yard on such a nice summer day wouldn't be overly risky because lots of neighbors would be outside. Plus, it was just a few train stops away from my workplace, and I was going to be off in a few hours. I did tell him I wasn't overly comfortable with the idea since I didn't know him well, but I would stop by for a bit if I didn't need to go inside the house at all. He said that was totally fine, which made me feel a lot better. I even made sure not to drink anything for the rest of my shift so I wouldn't be risking needing to go inside to use the bathroom. I was anxious about just showing up to a barbecue with people I didn't know at all, as he implied that the event was already underway. Plus, I would have had a hard time finding a specific address from the backyard side. So I asked if Simon could meet me at the train station, since he said it was a quick walk anyway. He agreed to do that, and I let him know when I was leaving work, and what time maps said the train would get to his station. I sent Simon a message to tell him that I had arrived at the train station around 5:30 after I looked around and couldn't find him. He told me he was running a little behind and to just start walking toward the neighborhood. I was about halfway across the massive train station parking lot when I saw him slowly wandering toward me. I recognized his clothes. He was wearing bell-bottoms when they weren't common, especially for men. And he had long hair. But up close, his face looked pretty different from his photos. It might have been some heavy-duty editing. I don't even know. But he kind of looked like a different guy. Older-looking than the 25-year-old guy in the photos by 5 or 10 years. Maybe he used photos of his brother or something. I don't even know. This was before AI. That was the first real red flag, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just self-conscious. Maybe he smokes a lot and doesn't wear sunscreen and hasn't taken pictures in a while. All of his pictures look candid, so I figured he wasn't much of a selfie guy. And besides, I was mostly there to make friends anyway, so I didn't want to judge his appearance so harshly. He was also clearly already drunk. But a lot of my ex's friends were heavy drinkers, so that didn't seem strange. I mean, he was hosting a barbecue after all. The second red flag came shortly after when we arrived at his front door. I reminded him that I wasn't comfortable going inside the house, but he assured me we would just have to walk through to get to the backyard. Okay, fine. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you could just walk around the house to get to the backyard. We would have had to backtrack to the main road to go down the alley directly to the backyard. I figured he just forgot about what I said about not wanting to go inside, and I didn't want to cause a bunch of trouble, so I went with it. We got in the house, and he immediately closed the door and locked the deadbolt and knob behind me. I didn't think it was too weird since nobody was hanging out inside, and a lot of people are just in the habit of locking the door when they go in. But it still did give me the heebie-jeebies for some reason. Then, Simon told me he'd really like to give me a tour of the house. I politely declined and reminded him that I was just there for the barbecue. He said that he and his bandmates had worked really hard to get the house, and he was really proud of it. At that point, I was getting really skeptical because usually when guys would tell me things like that, it seemed a bit far-fetched that they'd let the truth slip by the time they got me to their house. But still, I convinced myself that I was being unreasonable. I was already in the stupid house anyway, and he insisted it would be quick. Not the wisest choice, I know, but I was pretty good at explaining away red flags. At that point, Simon still mostly had a dopey stoner art guy kind of vibe as far as I was concerned. He really didn't seem like a threat, just an insecure oddball who sucked at communicating and fibbed a lot. Not unlike my ex, who was definitely emotionally and verbally abusive, but it never escalated past that. I figured at worst he'd get handsy and I'd get called a prude for not sleeping with him. I will say I didn't have a lot of self-worth at the time, obviously, and I went with things. The tour started pretty uneventfully, other than that the decor in the common areas was obviously chosen by a middle-aged Martha Stewart enthusiast, and not a bunch of guys in a band or their fake band manager. I didn't know if that should make me feel better or worse. I mean, on one hand, he was clearly lying, but on the other, it made me think it was probably just someone's mom's house and she was out of town and he didn't want to tell me he lived at a friend's parents' home and probably didn't actually have a paying job. Again, total red flag, but I rationalized it at the time. The bedroom doors were all closed and the bathroom was unremarkable. He then showed me the kitchen and I finally saw through the window that there was no one in the backyard. There weren't even barbecue supplies around. No burgers thawing on the counter, no cocktail supplies lying around, nothing. I asked him where everyone was and why he lied about the barbecue, and he told me that his bandmates were still on tour. They were just running behind due to van trouble, but they should be back any minute so we could start the party. I asked him why he wasn't on tour with them if he was in the band. I don't even remember what his answer was to that because it didn't make any sense. At that point, I was out of mental gymnastics to convince myself that this guy was completely full of shit, and now I was really freaked out. I mean, it took me long enough. I'm smarter now, don't worry. I started trying to figure out a way to get out of this situation. I hoped that once he was done with the tour, we could go inside, even just for a minute, and I'd just leave. I'd been in some sketchy situations in the past, but luckily nothing so bad that they tried very hard to physically stop me when I walked away in a semi-public place. I just wasn't comfortable doing it inside the house. I knew this guy was full of shit, but I had no idea how much worse things would get. I instinctively pretended to believe his bullshit. He offered me a beer, and I said no thanks because I had to work in the morning. He said okay and cracked one for himself. Then he wanted to take the tour downstairs. I could see from the top of the stairs that the basement was the dark and creepy kind, and had really small windows, so I refused. I asked if we could go back outside, and he said after the tour. I tried to argue about going into the basement, told him that I had a spider phobia and didn't like basements, etc. I mean, it was all lies, but anything that wouldn't let him realize that he was what I was afraid of. He started to get agitated about my reluctance, so I figured it would be better to just let him show me the damn basement, and then hopefully we could go outside because I really didn't know what else to do. The basement was fairly unremarkable. Couch, TV, elliptical, until I noticed something that gave me chills. The house was built probably in the 1990s or late 80s at the absolute earliest, but I saw a door that looked just like the heavy foam-lined door to the cold storage room in my grandma's house. the kind that only opens from the outside. It was just a smaller version of the big metal doors on commercial walk-in fridges, and it looked really out of place in this house. I absolutely did not go anywhere near that door. He opened it and told me it was their soundproof music studio. I looked inside from a few meters away, and it did indeed look soundproof. It was about the size of a bedroom, and I could see a few guitars and amps in it, mattress toppers on the walls, no drum kit or recording equipment that I could see. He insisted I go inside to get a better look. He was standing outside the door, motioning for me to go inside, and holy shit, the alarm bells were really going off then. At that point, I realized I could totally die there if I wasn't careful, and I turned around and ran up the stairs. He closed the door and followed me up, asking what was wrong, acting like I was being all unreasonable for not wanting to see his soundproof music studio. At that point, I was realizing that this was a way sketchier situation than any of my ex's bullshit, and I was freaked right out. At that point, my main objective was getting out of the house. The front and back doors were both closed and locked, so if I tried to run, he would have been able to get to me before I could get the locks open. The bathroom didn't have a window, and the house had a convoluted floor plan that I wasn't familiar with. And he was much bigger than I was. He was the tall, lanky type who could run fast even if they were out of shape and smoked a pack a day. I just pretended that I was okay with hanging out with him in the hopes that he'd chill out a bit. We made small talk for a few minutes, and he cracked another beer, and thankfully he calmed down. I desperately mentioned yet again that it was beautiful outside, and he suggested we go sit in the yard while we waited. He said no and started to get agitated that I wanted to leave already. I told him that I could stay, but I just really wanted to smoke a cigarette. He told me that we could smoke cigarettes inside and pointed to a cereal bowl full of cigarette butts. God damn it. We sat down at the table and lit some cigarettes. As he was smoking, he started rolling a joint, which he promptly lit as soon as his cigarette was done. He offered me some, and I said no thanks. But he insisted, so I took the smallest puff I could. I'm a pretty seasoned weed smoker, but I pretended to cough excessively and told him I was a novice, so that was more than enough for me. For a liar himself, he thankfully wasn't good at picking up on the lies of others. After we smoked, he asked if I'd like to watch a movie until his bandmates got back. I told him that I was really looking forward to spending the day outside and suggested we go for a walk or visit the park. Ideas he did not like or appreciate. At that point, I was trying to keep as much distance as possible between us, but he stayed close enough to me that I could smell the beer on his breath. He grabbed me by the waist, and I backed away and asked about the barbecue food to try to change the subject and make him think I still believed what he had been telling me. He started to get angry again and sternly reiterated that his bandmates should be home any minute, and my anxiety was absolutely through the roof. I tried to calm him down again with generic small talk. Now, I don't know how I got so lucky, but the next thing that happened might have saved me. Simon went to the fridge to get another beer and pulled out an empty box. At that point, he was getting even more pissed off than before, so I went out on a limb and suggested we go get some more beer for the party, because at that point I was out of ideas. I was terrified that it would enrage him even more to suggest once again that we leave the house, but I had to try. Thankfully, though, his eyes lit up with the possibility that I could actually be down to drink with him, so he agreed. As we were walking to the liquor store, I still didn't really have a plan because I was no longer comfortable just walking away from this fucking menace in this weirdly desolate suburb. But I was extremely relieved to be out of that house. I walked with him to the liquor store, and when we got there, I told him I didn't need to go inside if he was just going to go grab some beer. He insisted that I go inside with him, and at that point I was so stressed and frazzled, I just went with him and hoped that a good opportunity to leave would arise. When we got inside the liquor store, he asked what kind of beer I wanted. I reminded him that I had to work tomorrow and didn't want to drink too much, but he demanded to know what kind of beer I wanted, so I just named the first one that came to mind. We went to pay, and the cashier was kind of an asshole, so I didn't ask him for help. I probably should have, but I panicked and didn't. I hoped there might be somebody in the parking lot who might help me if I made a scene, but there was nobody out there. Afterwards, I really regretted not asking the liquor store guy for help, but I also remembered the times my ex told people that I was crazy so they wouldn't take me seriously. Liquor store guy definitely seemed like he would have fallen for that, so maybe it was for the best that I didn't expect him to help me. I had one last idea before I took my chances just trying to run and or scream. There was a drugstore across from the liquor store, and I told Simon I had to go buy a toothbrush or some shit that vaguely implied I might stay over. He eagerly agreed to this, but tried to follow me into the store, and I told him he wasn't allowed to bring beer into a drugstore. I don't even know if that's true. I doubt it's any kind of law, but luckily, this drunk douchebag believed it and agreed to wait outside. Now, my naive ass thought maybe I could just wander around in the drugstore for long enough, and he would either get the hint or get sketched out or bored and leave. But no, I must have wandered around the store for at least half an hour, and this jackass was still just standing there staring in the window. I mean, this creep didn't even have his phone out. Every time I checked if he was still there, he was just staring through the window looking at me. I didn't feel like I had anybody I could call in the city to come help me, and the cops here usually don't take things like that very seriously, and the store workers looked like they were mostly high school students, and I didn't want to drag them into it, so I didn't really feel like I had a lot of options. After being in there for so long, I was surprised he didn't come in to see what was taking me so long. I thought maybe I could lose him in the aisles and sneak out the store if he did come in. But nope. I ended up hovering around the tills and waited until a big group of friendly-looking people were paying. I followed them out of the store and immediately told Simon to leave me alone and go home. I said it firmly and loudly enough to imply that I would make a scene if need be. Simon looked at the people getting into their car, who now paused and looked at us, because I just had yelled at him, and he then just turned around and left. It was bizarrely anticlimactic, which I was very thankful for. I ran to the train station, which thankfully was in a different direction than his house from the store, and I never heard from him again. When I got home, his app profile had either blocked me or been deleted. Years later, after I stopped compartmentalizing the whole thing, I wish I would have reported him or something. It bothers me to wonder if he tried it again with someone else, but made sure the fridge was stocked first. But at the time, I didn't think anybody would take me seriously. I was very embarrassed about my choices, and I just wanted to move on from the whole thing. Plus, all I really had was a likely fake first name and a general idea of where the house was, which probably wasn't even his. I'll probably never know any more than I do now, and maybe that's for the best. So, Simon, you lying piece of shit, let's not meet again. And to everyone else, please don't be afraid to meet people or go on dates, but be cautious. Be curious, but you don't need to be fearful. My situation was not normal at all. Man in the Bushes by Bubbly Argument. This story takes place about a year ago. Me and my boyfriend, who at the time had just turned legal age, were strolling down a recreational park path. Bear in mind, it wasn't late, around 7 p.m., but in England in winter it gets dark around 4-ish. Funnily enough, we were having a debate, and this will come back up later. We were speaking quite loudly and stupidly, in the pitch black. We weren't at all paying attention to our surroundings. Yeah, stupid, I know. But we had done the same walk out of this park 3 times a week for the last month. Around 10 minutes into the 30-minute walk back into our little town center, and any point of civilization, we started hearing leaves crunching. Now, I'm an extremely paranoid person, like I'm still afraid to sleep in the dark, but he isn't, so I chose to ignore things and pretend that I didn't hear anything. I thought it was a small animal, though from what I can remember, the steps were way too heavy to be done by an animal in England. So we continued to have our conversation while I pushed it to the back of my mind. The problem with the conversation was the context was relating to back when I was 14. I was vividly discussing life about 14, painting a picture without specifying that I wasn't a child. I stand at 5'3", whereas my boyfriend is 6'4", but we both were clearly sounding immature, and I can and have easily been mistaken for 14 or 15 still. At the height of the discussion, we ended up stopping on the path, another stupid fault of our own, I know, but for a minute or so I didn't hear anything, and almost chalked everything else I had heard up to paranoia. Then the leaves behind some thick bushes started crunching again. My boyfriend decided to get his flashlight up on his phone and try to see through the trees, while I stood back facing away from them, about 150 centimeters apart from him. I was still talking, assuming that he didn't see anything since he was staring, trying to lean over the bushes for a bit. He then said, "Come on, let's just walk faster to be safe," and forcefully moved me along. After about 5 minutes of speed walking, we made it back near civilization, and I caught my breath and asked if he had seen anything. Now, in the light, I could see how pale his face was, and he proceeded to tell me, and this is his words from what I can remember, "I honestly couldn't see anything, but while you were chatting, the footsteps were moving away from me and towards your direction, like they were going forward just away from me. Something shined off my flashlight, so I panicked and then dragged you along." He's since tried to pacify my mind, saying, yeah, maybe it was an animal. But the consistency of the steps and the fact that a blinding light didn't scare an animal off, such as a deer, and in fact made it come closer, makes me believe it was someone or something more sinister. To whatever it was hiding there in the bushes, or coming after me, let's not meet again. Four stories of how I dodged 4 bullets, submitted by Anonymous. I'm a woman in my 50s. It's occurred to me recently that I've survived 4 situations in my life where I was in potentially high levels of danger. The first 2 happened in the early to mid-80s when I was 10 to 12 years old. The last 2 happened within the last 3 years when I was newly single and using dating apps. Names have been changed or omitted. Story 1. The Ice Cream Man. When I was a kid, I lived in a suburban neighborhood in a small city. Back then, kids were given free rein and we were allowed to wander the neighborhoods. There was a local ice cream truck that was famous throughout the city and was the only game in town at that time. Everyone knew when Icy's was in the neighborhood from the telltale sound of their bell and the white truck with the pictures of ice cream on the side. One day, my friend and I were walking a couple of streets over from my house when we noticed a blue ice cream truck playing a jingle through a loudspeaker. My friend had some money, so she decided to flag down the truck, and it pulled up beside us, and inside was a man in his 20s. He had brown, wavy hair, and his eyes perked up when he saw us, particularly my friend. He asked us what we were doing and where we lived. I immediately got a strange feeling. However, my friend showed him her house and told him that we were out in the neighborhood all the time. He was really chatting her up and gave her ice cream for free. For about 2 weeks, we saw that ice cream truck almost every day. He'd stop us, talk to us, and usually gave us free or discounted ice cream and treats. The entire time, something felt off to me. I didn't understand why this man was taking such an interest in my friend and the lives of two 10-year-olds. After about 2 weeks, the man asked us if we wanted to go for a ride in his truck, and my friend immediately said yes. I pulled her aside and told her that we shouldn't go because he was a stranger. And she said, well, he's my friend. She then called me a baby and hopped in his truck, and he started driving away. I stood there, frozen in shock. I wondered what I would tell our parents and the police. I was just standing there frozen in the street. Then, after driving about 5 houses down, he stopped the truck and let her out at the corner. I remember finally breathing when she got out, and came back running saying, "See, you're such a baby, everything was fine." At that time, I remember thinking that maybe I was overreacting. But as an adult, I realized that I absolutely was not overreacting. He was grooming her, and his final goal was to get one or both of us into that truck. I firmly believe that the only reason he dropped her off was because I was a witness. And I also firmly believe that if I had gotten in with her, we likely would have never been seen again. And guess what? After that day, we never saw him around the neighborhood again. Story 2. The Blue Car. During the summer when I was 12, I was again walking around my neighborhood. My street intersected with another street, and the other street ran through the neighborhood and intersected with many others. When I got to the intersection, a large blue car pulled up. The car was parked on the other side of the street. There was a woman driving and a man in the passenger seat, and I would say that they were in their mid-20s to early 30s. The woman had long blonde hair and the man had short brown hair, and she asked me how to get to a street that was approximately 5 streets away. I told her how to get there and pointed her in the right direction. She looked at me and said, "I can't hear you. Can you come closer?" I thought this was strange, but I also thought that maybe she couldn't really hear very well. So I cautiously took 1 step closer and raised my voice. I gave her the same directions, and she said again, "I can't hear you. Can you come closer?" At that point, my stomach dropped and I knew there was something bad going on. If I had taken 1 or 2 steps closer, I could have easily been grabbed and pulled into that car. I looked at her finally and said, "I'm sorry, if you can't hear me, you need to ask someone else." The couple stared at me for a few seconds and then drove away. I waited until I couldn't see their car anymore, and then I ran home, and I never saw them again. Story 3. Scary Date. A few months after my divorce, I decided to try out some dating apps. I went on a few dates with mixed results. However, this one really freaked me out. I matched with a 50-year-old man. We texted and spoke on the phone briefly and made plans for a lunch date. The restaurant was in a well-populated, busy area. He got there a few minutes before me and was sloppily chowing down on chips and salsa as I walked up. As soon as I sat down, he gave me a creepy smile. His eyes widened and he said, "Oh." It made me uncomfortable, and I should have listened to my gut and left right then. He had a drink in front of him and immediately asked if I wanted a margarita. When I told him that I didn't drink, he seemed really disappointed, and he rudely asked the waiter for another drink. We started talking about jobs, family, hobbies, etc. When I mentioned that I used to be a social worker, he got an angry and accusatory look on his face and said, "Well, my daughter's in jail." I didn't know how to react and said, "I'm sorry to hear that." But his face immediately changed and he smiled and said, "That's okay." He continued to order 2 more drinks while being rude to the waitstaff and making a comment about how they probably didn't even speak English. As the date was coming to an end, he told me he wanted to see me again, and I told him that I didn't feel like we clicked and that I wasn't interested. He continued to insist, despite my protest, and said he could take me out on his boat. I told him that it appeared that he doesn't hear the word no too often. He got really aggravated. We paid, left, and walked out, and we were now on the sidewalk as I said goodbye. He leaned over to kiss me. I held my hand up and told him that I was not interested, and he angrily looked me in the eyes and said, "No, you are going to kiss me." FYI, he was 10 inches taller than me and outweighed me by at least 75 pounds. I started walking away and he grabbed my shoulder, but I pulled away and said, "What the fuck? Leave me alone." I jumped in my car, which was parked in front of the restaurant. My head was spinning, and I pulled out and looked in my rearview mirror and noticed that he was getting into his car. Wouldn't you know it, it happened to be parked right behind me. The whole way home, I was looking in my mirror to make sure that he wasn't following me. And just to be sure, I drove by my local police station and sat in the lot for a few minutes. All I could think of was that if he was willing to behave that way on a busy street in broad daylight, what would he act like if we were alone, or in a more secluded area, or on his boat? Story 4. Let's go for a ride. About a year after the scary date, I met another man through a different app who was another level of creepy. I met him after we communicated a few times, and he was very talkative and intelligent, but I thought that he may be a little self-involved. I figured I'd meet him anyway and see how things went. We met at a coffee shop in the late morning, and he talked my ear off for about an hour. After that, we decided to leave and go for a walk around the town. When we stepped out of the coffee shop, he showed me his bright red sports car that literally looked like it was driven off the lot before he got there. He was bragging about how fast it went and showed off the touch sensors on the door handles. I mean, I really don't care about cars, but I'd never seen touch sensor door handles, so I told him that they were cool. I suggested that we go for a walk around the town square, and as we were walking, he mentioned that he quit school when he was younger. When I asked him if he was of the age where you could just sign yourself out at 16, he got all weird, and he said he didn't know. When I asked him how old he was, he said he didn't know. When I asked him if he knew what year he was born, he told me. At that point, I did the math in my head. He was 5 years older than he originally said he was. When I used the date he gave me to try to figure out the year he could have quit school, he started saying, "There's no way you could know. I mean, maybe I stayed back, or maybe I started school late." Either way, the conversation was giving off very weird vibes. I suggested we go back to the coffee shop, and as soon as we got there, he said, "Let's go for a ride." Calling his bluff, I said, "Okay, I'll drive." He insisted on driving, but I told him that I was not comfortable getting in his car because I barely knew him, but he kept insisting that he should drive. I finally said, "If you're going to insist on driving, I guess this is where we part ways." He calmly said okay and looked me directly in the eyes. We shook hands and left. You know, that last one, I could have been overthinking the whole thing and making assumptions. I mean, maybe, but as I was driving home, I got the feeling that somehow I once again dodged a bullet. I think I may have been a target by Automatic Simple. I apologize for being vague. I just want to remove as many signifiers as possible to keep my anonymity. Do note the events took place roughly at night, so it was quite dark. I was out walking to get my partner some soup and apples. She was pregnant and having trouble keeping food and liquids down. Before she asked about the apples, I had taken 5 or 2 milligram of THC gummies, and it's perfectly legal where I live. Since it was dark and getting to be time for our child to go to bed, I decided to take some since I hadn't planned on leaving our home for the evening, so her request caught me off guard. I couldn't drive, so I told her I would walk to grab the stuff. On my way to the store, about halfway through my initial walk, I saw a vehicle drive by me really slow and then stop at a stop sign at the end of the road I was on. It was the road that I was going to get to the grocery store. The vehicle was possibly an older, roughly 2000s make blue-silver SUV. I couldn't get a good look at the emblem on the car, so I couldn't get the make or model. However, it could have possibly been a Toyota RAV. Anyway, whoever was driving it turned really slowly and then stopped for a moment. Then, the vehicle turned onto a smaller highway that should have been heading away from my location if they continued on its path. They went probably 25 to 35 kilometers an hour for about a minute, and then finally drove off. I got to the store and grabbed my items, and I was the only one in there for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I started walking back to my house. I was on my way back down the connecting road, and I got to the end and turned left towards a small connecting road going into a neighborhood I generally walked through. I stepped to the left side of the road on this small connector, and a vehicle that looked a lot like the one I saw earlier pulled by me and started to turn. It stopped after it passed the stop sign at the main road into the neighborhood, and I stopped walking at that point. The vehicle stayed there motionless, and I took another step. Once I had taken that step, the vehicle moved forward very slightly and then stopped again. It then started to back up, and that's when I quickly went across the street and over a small hill to the side to put some distance between me and that vehicle. I was also thinking it would be more difficult for it to get up the incline if they decided to chase me. I looked back and saw that whoever was driving rolled down the window, and while I didn't get the best look, it looked like an older white man, maybe 40s or 50s. It was difficult to get the best view in the dark, and also it looked like he had gray facial hair. Not a long beard, more like a fuller scruff. I couldn't really make it out, but it did look like he had on a hat as well. But what really threw me off were the glasses that looked almost like sunglasses. I stopped for a second, and he didn't say anything. I didn't either. I waited for another couple of seconds and then started running. I guess they drove off. I didn't really hear the vehicle. I ran about halfway down the street and then tripped and fell over the ice that had accumulated on the ground. I looked around quickly to see if I could see the vehicle again, but I couldn't see it, so he may have turned around completely at that point. I then contemplated if I should ask someone for help, so I ended up ringing the doorbell on one of the individual homes in the neighborhood. I started talking to a roughly 13-year-old boy and asked if his parents were home. I didn't want to tell him anything. I didn't really want to scare the poor kid. I was pretty scared, though, and I explained to the mother that I believed someone was following me. While she was listening, she also called for her husband. The husband came, and a car drove by. While being extremely nervous and emotional, I said, "That's the vehicle," but upon further inspection I saw that it wasn't. I quickly corrected myself. I was asking them for help, but my mistake had broken their trust, and the husband told me to go away. I listened and did what he said because I was extremely sorry for bothering them. I just wanted to get home to my family. Plus, I could get how they were suspicious of me. I nervously ran through the neighbors' yards until I came up to where I could see car lights in front of an apartment complex in this neighborhood. I suspected if someone was following me that would be a great place to camp out. Lots of cars come and go there at all times of day and night. So I waited out of the line of sight of the road, and I started moving while still being out of sight. Then I heard it start moving. I quickly laid down by a tree in a neighbor's front lawn, and the vehicle came, and it looked exactly like the vehicle that had stopped earlier. It was also driving just as slow as last time. It also looked like the window was still rolled down. It went by me and pressed the brake for a second while it slowed, and then it slowly started to drive off again. I waited until it was completely out of sight and dashed towards my home. I fell and my phone flew out of my pocket, but I just grabbed my stuff and continued to my house. I made it all the way home before the vehicle could come back around, and thankfully, if they were a creep, they wouldn't know where I lived. Once inside, I called out to my wife and told her what happened. Something about the very first time seeing that car put me on edge. Other vehicles had passed me by on my walk here and there, but something was strange about that one. I'm never really put on edge like this. I mean, I grew up in a rougher place and have dealt with tons of interesting people. But this just set every alarm bell off at once, saying that I was in danger. I contemplated calling the police, but I thought since I'd taken the gummies, no one would believe a word I said, and they absolutely wouldn't have been at fault for being suspicious of me. Plus, because I was so on edge, I hadn't even thought about calling them when I first got suspicious. I don't think they would have believed me, so instead I called my father-in-law for advice. He advised me to do what I'm doing right now, writing down everything that I could remember. If I should encounter the vehicle or that guy again, I will call the police with this. If you think I completely misunderstood things, then please tell me. I mean, I want to be wrong. I'm so angry and frustrated right now. I could absolutely be wrong, but I don't believe I gave any indication of needing help. Plus, if the individual was trying to help me, why the silence with the window down? Why come back around after I booked it out of there? Especially waiting there, like they were expecting me to run that same way. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on the channel or podcast, email it to UncleJoshTrueScaryStories@gmail.com. I read them all. I apologize for some of these stories. I'm a little stuffed up, but this is life in the winter in the Northeast. Everybody's getting colds. If you have a second and you like what you heard, please give this video a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and maybe even tell some of your friends about it. I'd appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support of the channel a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, as well as a link to my TeePublic storefront. Pick yourself up some Uncle Josh or Campfire Crew merchandise. All the cool kids are doing it. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything, a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.